For the first 6 years of driving a taxi through Tokyo at night, nothing unusual ever happened. The city changed constantly. Buildings rose where parking lots once stood. Small restaurants disappeared between one season and the next. Neon signs blinked out forever and returned beneath different names. Entire neighborhoods seemed to reinvent themselves every few years. But the passengers rarely changed. Most were simply tired. Office workers returning home after long days. Students who had missed the final train. Couples speaking softly after dinner. Travelers dragging suitcases through unfamiliar streets. Every night followed the same rhythm. Rain or clear skies. Summer or winter. The city moved. The passengers came and went. And by dawn most of them were forgotten. That was why the driver remembered the nights so clearly. Because unlike every passenger before him, the first one left behind a question. A simple question. A question that remained with him long after the rain had ended. Long after the city had awakened. Long after the taxi meter had stopped counting. The question was this: a what year is it? Not a what day is it? Not a what month is it? Simply what year is it? At the time, it sounded almost harmless. A strange question, certainly. But strange questions were not uncommon after midnight, especially during rain. Rain changed people. The driver had learned that years ago. Something about the sound of water against glass encouraged memories to rise to the surface. Passengers often spoke more during storms. They spoke about old friends, old homes, old mistakes. Sometimes they spoke about people they had not seen for decades. Rain seemed to loosen the grip of the present. And so, whenever he thought back on that night, he initially blamed the weather. Perhaps that was all it had been. A tired passenger. A confused question. An ordinary misunderstanding. Yet even now, he could still remember every detail. The rain, the station lights, the smell of wet pavement, and the empty seat waiting behind him. The shift had begun shortly after 10. Heavy clouds had settled across Tokyo during the afternoon, and by evening the rain had become steady, not violent, not dramatic, simply persistent, the sort of rain that felt capable of continuing forever. The driver preferred nights like these. The city became quieter. The streets reflected endless rivers of color. Red brake lights stretched across black pavement. Neon signs floated within puddles. Entire buildings appeared twice, once in reality and once in reflection. The world slowed down. Inside the taxi, soft jazz played quietly through the speakers. The windshield wipers moved back and forth with patient rhythm. Outside, umbrellas drifted through the city like dark lanterns. The driver had always enjoyed observing people. Perhaps that was why he remained in the profession. Every passenger carried an invisible story. Most remained hidden. Some revealed themselves briefly. A few lingered long after the journey ended. As the hours passed, the night unfolded exactly as expected. An office worker traveling home to Setagare. A university student carrying textbooks and falling asleep before reaching her destination. A tourist asking questions about ramen shops despite speaking almost no Japanese. Nothing unusual. Nothing memorable. Midnight approached. Traffic thinned. The rain continued. One by one, the city began settling into its quieter self. The version of Tokyo that existed only after most people had gone home. The version illuminated by vending machines, convenience stores, apartment windows glowing softly in distant towers. A city half asleep. A city dreaming. Around 12:30, the driver found himself waiting outside a small station in western Tokyo. The trains had nearly stopped running. Only a handful of passengers emerged every few minutes. Most hurried directly toward waiting cars. Others disappeared beneath umbrellas and into side streets. The taxi meter remained idle. The driver watched raindrops gather along the windshield, then slide slowly downward. The station clock glowed pale white through the rain. 12:37 a.m. The city felt unusually still, not silent. Tokyo was never silent, but quieter than usual. the sort of quiet that made distant sounds seem strangely clear. Water flowing through drains, a bicycle chain turning somewhere nearby, footsteps beneath umbrellas. The driver adjusted the heater slightly. Outside, another train arrived. A small group of passengers emerged from the station. Most walked away immediately. One figure remained standing beneath the rain. The driver noticed him only because he wasn't moving. Everyone else seemed eager to leave the weather behind. This man simply stood there, motionless, watching the rain. For several moments he remained beneath the station lights. Then slowly, almost reluctantly, he began walking toward the taxi. The driver watched him approach through the windshield. A middle-aged salaryman, ordinary dark coat, ordinary briefcase, ordinary face. Nothing unusual. And yet, for reasons he could never fully explain later, the driver remembered feeling that something was slightly out of place. Not fear, not danger, only the faint sensation that a familiar song was being played in the wrong key. The rear door opened automatically. The passenger entered. Rainwater glistened across his coat sleeves. For a moment neither man spoke. The door closed softly. The city disappeared once more behind rain-covered glass. The driver glanced toward the rearview mirror. "Where to?" he asked. The passenger looked out toward the rain, then back toward the front seat. Before offering a destination, before mentioning an address, before saying anything else, he asked a question. "Excuse me." His voice was calm, almost cautious. "What year is it?" The driver frowned slightly. The question was strange, but not alarming. "It's 2025. The passenger froze. Not dramatically, not with shock. Something quieter. A long breath escaped him. The tension seemed to leave his shoulders all at once. For several seconds he stared through the rain-covered window. Then he smiled faintly. A tired smile, a relieved smile, and softly said, "Good." Another pause followed. The city drifted slowly beyond the glass. Traffic lights reflected across wet pavement. Rain tapped gently against the roof. Finally, the passenger spoke again. "So I still have time." The driver felt a small chill move through him, not because of the words, because of the certainty with which they had been spoken, as though the passenger already knew something the rest of the city did not. Outside, rain continued falling across Tokyo. Inside the taxi, the meter quietly began counting upward, and the longest night of the driver's life began. The driver waited for the passenger to say more. Most people eventually did. A strange question was often followed by an explanation. A joke, a story, an apology, something. But the man simply sat in silence. Outside, rain drifted across the windows. Inside the taxi, soft jazz continued playing beneath the steady rhythm of the windshield wipers. The driver glanced briefly toward the rearview mirror. The passenger seemed completely ordinary, middle-aged, well-dressed, the sort of person nobody would remember after passing on the street. Yet the question lingered. "What year is it?" And then, "So I still have time." The driver found himself wondering what that meant. Time for what? A train? A meeting? A flight? But after years of driving night shifts, he had learned not to pry into other people's lives. Eventually the passenger looked up. "Could you take me to Shinjuku Station?" The request sounded perfectly normal. The driver entered the destination into the navigation system and pulled away from the curb. The taxi merged back into the sleeping city. For several minutes neither man spoke. The streets glistened beneath traffic lights. Rainwater collected along gutters. The occasional cyclist hurried through the darkness beneath a transparent umbrella. The city felt distant, almost dreamlike, as if everyone still awake existed within a different version of Tokyo than the millions already asleep. The driver had always liked that feeling. Night revealed a different city, a quieter one, a more honest one. During the day, people rushed. At night, they remembered things. The passenger suddenly leaned slightly toward the window. His eyes followed the passing streets. The driver noticed the expression immediately. recognition, wonder, confusion, all at once, as though he were seeing something familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. Has something changed? The passenger asked quietly. The driver smiled. Tokyo changes every year. The man nodded slowly. For a moment he seemed about to say something. Then he remained silent again. The taxi continued through the rain. A convenience store glowed beside an intersection. Its bright lights reflected across the wet pavement. The passenger watched it disappear behind them. Then he asked another question. How long has that been there? The driver glanced toward the mirror. The convenience store? Yes. The driver shrugged slightly. A few years, maybe. The passenger looked genuinely surprised. A few years' his voice carried the distant tone of someone trying to solve a difficult puzzle. Again silence followed. The driver found himself becoming increasingly curious. Most unusual passengers eventually revealed the reason for their behavior. This man seemed to be searching for something. Not a destination, not a building, something else, something harder to name. The city continued sliding past outside. Apartment towers, restaurants, train crossings, billboards illuminated by rain. The passenger observed everything carefully, too carefully, like a traveler visiting a foreign country for the first time, or someone returning home after a very long absence. Several minutes later, traffic forced the taxi to stop at a red light. The passenger stared across the intersection. A large office building stood beyond the crossing. Its glass exterior reflected hundreds of tiny lights. The man frowned. That wasn't there before. The driver laughed softly. Most things weren't there before. For the first time, the passenger smiled, a genuine smile. Then he looked down toward his hands. You're right. Rain tapped gently against the roof. The light turned green. The taxi continued forward. Neither man noticed how empty the streets had become, or how few vehicles remained around them. The city seemed to be retreating deeper into sleep. Even the rain sounded quieter now. The passenger leaned back into his seat. His gaze drifted upward, toward the ceiling, toward nothing in particular. Then he asked, do people still use cassette tapes? The driver blinked. Cassette tapes. The passenger nodded. The driver laughed again. Not really. The man smiled faintly. I thought so. There was no sadness in his voice, only acceptance, like someone confirming something they had known all along. The answer seemed to satisfy him, and for the first time since entering the taxi, he appeared relaxed, completely relaxed. The tension that had accompanied him from the station was gone. The driver realized something then. The passenger was not worried about where he was going. He was relieved simply to be here, wherever here happened to be. The rain continued. The city drifted by. And somewhere ahead, hidden among countless lights and sleeping buildings, Shinjuku Station waited. The driver did not yet know it, but before the night ended, he would meet 3 more passengers, and each one would leave behind a question that would follow him long after dawn. For now, however, there was only the rain, the city, the taxi, and the man quietly watching the future that seemed to belong to someone else. The closer they moved towards central Tokyo, the more the passenger seemed to study the city, not casually, not the way tourists observed on familiar places. The man watched with the concentration of someone searching for differences. Every illuminated sign, every building, every passing train, nothing escaped his attention. The driver found himself watching through the rearview mirror more often than usual. Years of night shifts had given him a quiet understanding of people. Passengers revealed themselves through small things. How they sat, how they looked out the window, whether they spoke, whether they avoided speaking. This man carried none of the nervousness often seen in intoxicated customers, nor the exhaustion of office workers returning home. Instead, he seemed occupied by a private mystery, one that existed somewhere beyond the rain-covered glass. The taxi crossed a narrow bridge. Below, dark water-reflected rows of apartment lights. The passenger watched silently. Then he spoke. "Do people still live there?" The driver glanced briefly toward the river. "Of course." The passenger nodded, as though confirming another detail, another piece of information, another answer. The driver almost asked what exactly the man was trying to understand. Almost. But curiosity rarely led anywhere useful in his profession. Most passengers preferred silence, and silence suited rainy nights. The city beyond the windshield seemed half asleep. Traffic lights changed for nearly empty intersections. Vending machines glowed on quiet corners. Occasionally another taxi drifted past in the opposite direction, its headlights cutting briefly through the darkness, then disappearing. For several minutes neither man spoke. The passengers simply watched. The driver simply drove. Rain filled the space between them. They entered a district lined with new office towers. Glass buildings rose above the streets. Their reflection stretched across wet pavement. The passenger stared upward. A faint expression crossed his face. Not surprise, not confusion. Something closer to disbelief, as though reality had quietly disagreed with one of his expectations. "Those are new." The driver smiled. "Most of them are." The man continued watching. "When were they built?" The driver shrugged. "I couldn't tell you exactly." The passenger nodded slowly. Again, always another small answer. Always another silent calculation. The driver found himself becoming increasingly certain of one thing. The passenger wasn't pretending. Whatever confusion surrounded him seemed genuine. That thought should have been reassuring. Instead, it made the situation feel stranger. Because if the man truly believed what he was saying, then what exactly did he think had happened? Several blocks later they stopped at another red light. A giant electronic billboard illuminated the intersection. Advertisements shifted every few seconds. Bright colors reflected across the taxi windows. The passenger stared at the display, then unexpectedly laughed. A quiet laugh, almost nostalgic. The driver looked toward the mirror. The passenger shook his head. Nobody would have believed this. The driver smiled politely. Believed what? The man seemed surprised by the question, as though he had forgotten someone else occupied the vehicle. He looked toward the billboard again, then toward the countless lights surrounding them. The city. The driver waited, but the passenger offered nothing more, only a faint smile and silence. The rain gradually became lighter, not enough to stop, only enough to change its sound. The steady drumming against the roof softened into a quieter rhythm. The driver adjusted the windshield wipers. The passenger watched the movement, back and forth, back and forth. For several moments he seemed distracted by it. Then he asked another question, a simple question, the sort of question nobody would normally ask. "Has it been peaceful?" The driver frowned slightly. "Peaceful?" The passenger nodded. The city lights reflected across his glasses. "The years." The driver considered the question. It felt oddly old-fashioned, the sort of thing someone might ask after returning from a very long journey. "I suppose so." The passenger seemed relieved, not dramatically, just enough for the driver to notice. The man looked out toward the rain once more, and quietly whispered, "That's good." Something about those words remained with the driver, not because they were unusual, but because of the emotion behind them. Relief. Genuine relief. The sort that came after carrying a burden for a long time. For the first time that night, the driver began wondering if perhaps the passenger wasn't confused at all. Perhaps he was simply remembering something differently, remembering a city that no longer existed. After all, Tokyo changed constantly. Entire districts transformed within decades. Old landmarks disappeared. New ones emerged. A person returning after 30 or 40 years might barely recognize certain neighborhoods. That explanation felt reasonable, comforting even. The driver settled on it quickly, perhaps too quickly, because deep down, another possibility had already begun taking shape. a possibility he would not fully confront until much later, when the second passenger entered the taxi, and the night became impossible to explain. The driver would later spend a great deal of time thinking about that moment, not because anything extraordinary had happened, quite the opposite. The city remained ordinary. The rain remained ordinary. Even the passenger appeared ordinary. Yet something beneath the surface felt increasingly difficult to explain. The taxi continued toward Shinjuku. Traffic lights changed. Pedestrians crossed intersections beneath umbrellas. Trains moved through the darkness on elevated tracks. Everything appeared exactly as it should, and still, the passenger kept looking at the city as though he had been away for a very long time. A few minutes later they passed a row of convenience stores and restaurants. Bright signs reflected across the wet pavement. The passenger watched them carefully. His eyes moved from one storefront to the next, reading, comparing, remembering. The driver noticed something strange. The passenger never seemed surprised by technology, never stared at smartphones, never reacted to electronic billboards. Instead, he reacted to buildings, to streets, to locations, as though places mattered more than objects, as though he already expected the future to exist. He simply did not expect it to look exactly like this. The taxi approached a district filled with office towers. Glass walls reflected thousands of lights. The passenger stared upward. For a long time he said nothing. Then he asked quietly, "Do people still work late?" The driver laughed softly. "Probably more than they should." The passenger smiled. The answer seemed familiar to him, comforting, somehow. Outside, another train crossed above the road. Its windows glowed warmly against the darkness. The passenger followed it until it disappeared. Then he leaned back once more. The driver noticed the man's briefcase resting beside him. An ordinary briefcase, one slightly at the corners. The sort of thing thousands of office workers carried every day. Nothing unusual, yet something about it felt oddly old-fashioned. Not antique, not outdated, simply belonging to a different time. Rain continued falling softly. The city drifted past. The passenger remained silent for several minutes. Then he suddenly asked, "Are people happy?" The driver blinked. The question arrived so unexpectedly that he almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because nobody asked questions like that. At least not in taxis. Most passengers asked about traffic, or weather, or train schedules, not happiness. The driver considered the question, then shrugged slightly. "Some are." The passenger nodded. "And some aren't." "That's probably true too." The man smiled faintly, as though that answer made perfect sense, as though it was exactly what he expected. For a while neither man spoke. The rain filled the silence between them. Eventually the bright lights of Shinjuku began appearing ahead. Towering buildings emerged through the rain. Electronic billboards illuminated entire streets. Traffic increased. Even after midnight, parts of the district remained awake. The passenger watched everything, quietly, attentively, almost respectfully. The driver suddenly found himself imagining a strange possibility. What if the passenger had truly been gone for decades? Not time travel. Nothing impossible. Simply absence. Perhaps he had lived overseas. Perhaps he had spent years somewhere remote. Perhaps he had left Tokyo long ago and only recently returned. The explanation felt reasonable. The driver wanted it to be reasonable, because the alternative felt absurd. And yet the question lingered. What year is it? Not what day is it? Not what month is it? What year is it? The taxi finally arrived outside Shinjuku Station. Rain continued falling across the city. Thousands of tiny reflections shimmered across the pavement. The passenger looked through the window. For several moments he simply sat there, watching. The driver assumed he was gathering his belongings, preparing to leave. Instead, the man smiled. Not at the driver, not at anything specific, simply at the city itself. A small smile, a relieved smile. The the sort of smile someone might wear after finding something they feared had been lost forever. Then he opened his briefcase. The driver expected him to retrieve a wallet. Instead, the passenger paused. His expression changed slightly. Confusion. He searched again, then a third time. The driver watched through the mirror. Finally, the passenger looked up. "I'm sorry." The words sounded genuinely embarrassed. "I don't think this money will be accepted anymore." The driver frowned. The passenger slowly removed several banknotes. The driver glanced toward them, then froze. Not because of the amount, because of their appearance. The designs looked older, much older. The sort of currency rarely seen outside collections or museums. For a moment neither man spoke. Rain tapped softly against the roof. The city lights reflected across the glass. The passenger looked down at the notes, then toward the station outside, and finally back toward the driver. A strange sadness appeared in his eyes. Not fear, not panic, only the sadness of someone realizing how much time had passed. The driver felt an unexpected hesitation. Then he quietly shook his head. "It's all right." The passenger stared at him. The driver smiled. "Consider it a free ride." For a moment, the man said nothing. Then he bowed his head slightly, a gesture of sincere gratitude, not exaggerated, not dramatic, simply genuine. "Thank you." The rear door opened. Cool night air drifted briefly into the taxi. The passenger stepped out into the rain. The driver watched him walk toward the station entrance. Dark coat, briefcase, umbrella-less, moving steadily through the falling rain. Then the crowd swallowed him, and he was gone. The driver sat quietly for several moments, watching the station, watching the rain, listening to the soft hum of the city. Eventually he reset the meter, adjusted the mirror, and prepared to continue the night. At the time, he believed the encounter had ended. A strange passenger, nothing more. A story he might remember for a few days before eventually forgetting. He had no way of knowing that another passenger was already waiting somewhere in the city, and that before dawn arrived, the impossible would happen again. For the next 30 minutes, nothing unusual happened. The driver picked up two ordinary passengers. One was a university student returning home after a late study session. The other was a businessman who spent most of the journey asleep. Both paid. Both left. Both were quickly forgotten. The city returned to its familiar rhythm, and gradually, the driver began convincing himself that the earlier encounter had been nothing more than an odd coincidence. A confused man, an old collection of banknotes, a strange conversation, nothing more. The explanation felt reasonable. Reasonable explanations were comforting, especially during long nights. The rain continued, not heavy, not light, simply steady, the kind of rain that became part of the city itself. By 2 o'clock in the morning, much of Tokyo had settled into silence. The roads remained open. The traffic lights continued their endless cycle. Convenience stores glowed softly at empty intersections. Yet the city felt quieter now, sleepier, as though the night had reached its deepest hour. The driver found himself waiting near a small station in Nerima. Only a handful of people remained outside. Most had already gone home. A bicycle stood abandoned beside a fence. Rainwater collected along the platform roof. A vending machine hummed softly beneath fluorescent light. The driver checked the time. 2:08 a.m. Then he settled back into his seat. The next passenger arrived only a few minutes later. At first, the driver almost failed to notice her. She emerged from the station carrying a transparent umbrella. A school uniform was visible beneath a dark coat. Her pace was unhurried, calm, almost absent-minded. She looked no older than 16 or 17, the sort of student who should have been asleep hours ago. The girl approached the taxi. The rear door opened, and she entered quietly. No rainwater dripped from her coat, no hurried breathing, no signs of rushing through the storm. She simply sat down and folded her umbrella carefully beside her. For several seconds neither of them spoke. The driver glanced toward the rearview mirror. The girl appeared tired. Not exhausted. Not unhappy. Simply thoughtful. As though her attention remained focused on something far away. Then she spoke. "Could you take me to Nakano, please?" The destination sounded ordinary enough. The driver entered it into the navigation system. The route appeared. The meter started. And the taxi pulled away from the curb. The girl carried a small shoulder bag. Nothing unusual, at least initially. As the taxi passed beneath a street light, the driver noticed something protruding slightly from the top. A plastic case. Rectangular. Transparent. For a moment he thought it might be an old notebook. Then he recognized it. A cassette tape. The sight felt strangely unexpected. Not impossible. Just unusual. Like spotting an old payphone still standing beside a modern building. The driver glanced toward the mirror again. The cassette case remained visible. The girl seemed completely unaware of it. Or perhaps she simply considered it normal. For several minutes they traveled in silence. The city slid past outside. Rain blurred distant lights into soft streaks of color. Apartment windows glowed warmly in the darkness. A train crossed overhead, its reflection rippling across wet pavement. The girl watched the city pass by, not unlike the previous passenger, though there was an important difference. The salaryman had looked at the city with confusion. The schoolgirl looked at it with familiarity, comfort, belonging, as though everything remained exactly as it should. Several minutes later, the taxi stopped at a red light. The girl suddenly leaned forward slightly, not enough to startle the driver, only enough to ask a question. "Do music stores still stay open this late?" The driver blinked. "Music stores," the girl nodded. "Record stores, cassette shops, places like that." The driver smiled faintly. "There aren't many left." The girl seemed surprised. "Really?" The driver nodded. "Most people just listen to music on their phones now." The girl stared quietly toward the rain-covered window. For several seconds she said nothing. Then she smiled. A small smile. The sort of smile someone wears when hearing an interesting story. "That's convenient." The answer felt strange. Not because of the words. Because of how sincerely she meant them. As though smartphones were still a novel idea. A distant possibility. A glimpse of the future. The driver felt a faint sensation in his chest. The same sensation he had experienced earlier that night. That feeling of hearing a familiar song played slightly wrong. Outside, rain continued falling. The light changed. The taxi moved forward, and somewhere deep inside the driver's mind, a possibility he had previously dismissed began quietly returning. A possibility that made no sense at all, yet somehow felt increasingly difficult to ignore. The salaryman, the old band notes, the question about the year, and now a schoolgirl carrying a cassette tape through a city that no longer used them. The driver tightened his grip slightly on the steering wheel, then immediately laughed at himself. Coincidences happened. People collected old things. People behaved strangely. That was all. That had to be all. Outside, Tokyo continued drifting past beneath the rain. Inside the taxi, the schoolgirl carefully rested one hand upon her bag, protecting the cassette tape as though it were something precious, something irreplaceable, and for reasons he could not explain. The driver found himself wondering who was waiting to receive it. The driver expected the girl to explain the cassette tape eventually. Most passengers revealed the reason for unusual things without realizing it. A photograph left visible. A ring turned repeatedly around a finger. A letter folded and unfolded throughout a journey. People carried stories with them, sometimes quite literally. The cassette tape seemed to be one of those stories. Yet the girl remained quiet, comfortably quiet, the sort of quiet that felt natural rather than awkward. Outside, rain drifted across the city. Traffic lights reflected upon wet roads. A distant train rolled through darkness beyond rows of apartment buildings. Tokyo seemed to be floating somewhere between night and morning, neither fully awake nor fully asleep. Several minutes passed before the girl spoke again. "Do people still make mixtapes?" The question arrived so suddenly that the driver almost missed it. "Mixtapes." She nodded. The cassette case remained partially visible above her bag. The driver smiled. "Not really." The girl looked down at her hands. "That's a shame." There was no sadness in her voice, only genuine disappointment, as though something simple and meaningful had quietly disappeared from the world. The driver considered the thought. Perhaps she wasn't entirely wrong. There had been something personal about recording music for someone else, something patient, something deliberate, the sort of thing people rarely had time for anymore. The girl stared out the window, watching rain-covered buildings pass by. Then she asked, "How do people tell each other things now?" The driver laughed softly. "Text messages, mostly." The answer seemed to amuse her. "That sounds much faster." "It is." The girl nodded thoughtfully, then looked back toward the city, as though imagining a future she had never seen. The taxi crossed a small intersection. A brightly lit electronics store stood on the corner. Large screens filled its windows. The girl watched it disappear behind them. For a moment her expression changed. Not confusion, not surprise. Something closer to wonder. The same expression people often wore inside museums, or while looking at old photographs. The driver felt another small chill. The salaryman had worn that same expression, the exact same one, as though both passengers were visitors, not tourists, not strangers, visitors from somewhere else, somewhere familiar, somewhere distant. Rain continued falling softly. The city remained quiet. The driver found himself thinking about the cassette tape again. Finally, curiosity won. "Is that important?" The girl blinked, then followed his gaze toward the bag, the cassette. Her expression softened immediately. "Very." The answer arrived without hesitation. She carefully removed the plastic case. The driver glanced toward the mirror. Inside sat an ordinary cassette tape. Handwritten label, neat handwriting, nothing unusual. Yet the girl handled it with extraordinary care, as though it contained something fragile, something irreplaceable. "What's on it?" the driver asked. The girl smiled. "A message." The answer seemed simple enough, yet something about it lingered. Not music, not recordings. A message. The driver expected her to elaborate. She didn't. Instead, she looked down at the cassette for several moments, then gently returned it to her bag. The city gradually became denser. More buildings, more lights, more signs reflecting through the rain. Nakano was approaching. The destination appeared only a few kilometers away. The driver noticed the girl looking increasingly thoughtful, as though she were rehearsing something in her mind, perhaps a conversation, perhaps a memory, perhaps words she hoped to say. Eventually she spoke again. "Do you ever miss people?" The question caught him off guard, not because it was unusual, because it felt unexpectedly personal. The driver considered it carefully, then nodded. "Sometimes." The girl smiled faintly. "I think everyone does." Outside, rain tapped gently against the windows. Neither spoke for a while. The city moved around them, silent, patient, dreamlike. Then the girl looked toward the passing lights and quietly said, "I hope he's still waiting." The driver glanced toward the mirror. The words seemed directed at no one in particular, perhaps not even at him. Yet they carried a weight that lingered long after they were spoken. Several minutes later, the taxi arrived. A quiet residential street. Rows of apartment buildings. Dim streetlights. Rain-soaked sidewalks. Nothing remarkable. The meter stopped. The girl looked through the window. For a moment she appeared relieved, then nervous, then hopeful, all within the span of a few seconds. The driver had seen many emotions during night shifts. Hope was among the rarest, especially after 2 in the morning. The girl reached into her bag. The driver expected a wallet. Instead she paused. Her expression changed. Slowly, almost imperceptibly. The same realization that had crossed the salaryman's face earlier. The same confusion. The same sadness. She looked down at the money in her hand, then toward the driver, then back toward the money. For several seconds neither spoke. Rain whispered against the roof. The city remained still. Finally the girl lowered her gaze. "I don't think this works anymore." The driver's stomach tightened, not because of the words, because he already knew what he would see. The bills looked old, older than they should have been, just like the salaryman's. Different year, different person, same impossible problem. The driver stared at them, and for the first time that night, he stopped searching for reasonable explanations, because reasonable explanations were beginning to run out. The girl looked genuinely embarrassed. "I'm sorry." The driver remained silent for a moment, then gently shook his head. "It's all right." She looked up, surprised. "Really?" The driver smiled. "Really?" Relief filled her face immediately. A quiet, grateful relief. The kind that couldn't be faked. She bowed slightly, then carefully picked up the cassette tape, protecting it instinctively, as though it mattered more than anything else she carried. The rear door opened. Cool night air entered the taxi. The girl stepped out beneath the rain. For a brief moment she stood beneath a streetlight, cassette tape held carefully against her chest. Then she walked away into the darkness. The driver watched until she disappeared. Long after she was gone, he remained seated, listening to the rain, watching the empty street, thinking about old band notes, thinking about cassette tapes, thinking about impossible coincidences. And somewhere deep inside, a realization had already begun to form. The night was not giving him passengers. It was giving him people from somewhere else, somewhere beyond his understanding. And before dawn arrived, a third passenger would make that realization impossible to ignore. The driver remained parked for several minutes after the schoolgirl disappeared. The meter had been reset. The taxi was ready for another passenger, yet he found himself staring through the rain-covered windshield, thinking. The salaryman, the cassette tape, the old money, the questions. Individually, each encounter could be explained. People collected old currency. People carried outdated technology. People behaved strangely. The city was full of unusual individuals. But together, the explanations began feeling increasingly fragile, like paper left too long in the rain. The driver rubbed his eyes. Perhaps he was simply tired. It was nearly 3 o'clock, the deepest part of the night, the hour when ordinary thoughts often became strange, when familiar streets appeared unfamiliar, when exhaustion quietly distorted perspective. That explanation felt comforting. He accepted it immediately, at least for a while. Eventually, the driver pulled away from the curb. The city welcomed him back. Traffic lights changed. Rain continued falling. Apartment towers watched silently from the darkness. The roads remained mostly empty. Only delivery trucks and taxis seemed awake now. Tokyo had entered one of its rare moments of stillness. The city would remain like this for another hour or two. Then dawn would arrive. Trains would fill. Coffee shops would open. Millions of lives would resume moving. But for now, the city belonged to night workers, taxi drivers, store clerks, security guards, and people who couldn't sleep. The driver crossed a quiet commercial district. Many storefronts were dark. Metal shutters covered their entrances. Only convenience stores remained brightly illuminated. Tiny islands of light scattered through the rain. As he approached an intersection, he noticed someone standing beneath a bus shelter. A woman, alone. No umbrella, no suitcase, no visible destination. She simply stood there, watching the rain. The sight immediately reminded him of the first passenger. That same stillness, that same feeling of waiting for something invisible. The driver almost continued past. Then the woman raised one hand, requesting a ride. The taxi slowed, pulled toward the curb, and stopped. The rear door opened automatically. The woman entered. Rainwater glistened faintly upon her coat, not soaked, not dry, as though she had been standing beneath shelter for a long time. The door closed. For a brief moment, neither spoke. The driver glanced toward the rear-view mirror. She appeared to be in her early 30s. Ordinary clothing, ordinary appearance, nothing immediately unusual, and yet the driver no longer trusted first impressions. "Not tonight. Where would you like to go?" The woman immediately answered, as though she had already rehearsed the destination. "Takashima Building." The driver blinked. The name sounded familiar. Very familiar. He had heard it somewhere before. Recently. Or perhaps long ago. For several moments he searched his memory. Then realization arrived. The building no longer existed. Not recently. Not within the last few years. It had been demolished long ago. The driver was almost certain of it. He glanced toward the navigation screen. Nothing appeared. No result. No address. No matching location. Only empty search results. The woman noticed. Her expression changed slightly. Confusion. Is something wrong? The driver hesitated. For a moment he considered saying nothing, then decided against it. "I'm not sure that building is still there." The woman laughed softly. A natural laugh. Not nervous. Not defensive. Simply amused. "Of course it's there." The certainty in her voice caught him off guard. The woman looked toward the rain-covered window, then added, "I was there last week." A small chill traveled through the driver. The certainty again. The same certainty. The salaryman had possessed it. The schoolgirl had possessed it. And now this woman did too. Outside, rain continued falling. Inside the taxi, neither spoke for several moments. The driver tried searching again. Nothing. The building simply didn't exist. At least not anymore. The woman watched him patiently, as though waiting for the misunderstanding to resolve itself. As though reality itself had made a mistake. Finally, the driver cleared his throat. "When was the last time you were there?" The woman answered immediately. "Last Thursday." The driver nodded slowly. A simple answer. An ordinary answer. Yet somehow it made everything feel stranger. Because he already knew what he would ask next, and part of him wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Outside, traffic lights reflected across wet pavement. The city drifted silently through the darkness. The driver glanced toward the rearview mirror, then quietly asked what year was that. The question lingered between them. Outside, rain continued falling softly across the city. The windshield wipers moved back and forth. Traffic lights reflected across wet pavement. For several moments, the woman simply stared at him, not because she was offended, not because she was confused, because she seemed surprised the question needed to be asked at all. Finally, she answered, 1998. The driver felt his stomach tighten, not dramatically, not with fear, just enough to make him grip the steering wheel slightly harder. The woman noticed nothing unusual. Sure, the answer seemed perfectly ordinary, perfectly reasonable, as natural as mentioning yesterday or last month. The driver looked toward the navigation screen again. Still nothing. No building, no address, no trace. Only rain-covered roads and sleeping neighborhoods waiting beyond the windshield. The woman leaned forward slightly. "Is it gone?" The question sounded cautious, almost reluctant. The driver hesitated, then nodded. "I think so." For a moment she remained silent. The city drifted past outside. A train crossing barrier blinked red in the distance. A convenience store glowed softly on a quiet corner. Everything felt strangely calm, the sort of calm that often arrived just before dawn. The woman looked down at her hands, then toward the rain-covered window. Neither spoke. The driver sensed she already knew the answer. Perhaps not consciously, but somewhere deep inside. The way people sometimes know a dream is ending before they wake. Several minutes passed. Eventually the woman smiled. A small smile. Not happy. not sad, just thoughtful. I always wondered what would happen. The driver glanced toward the mirror. What would happen if they tore it down? The answer arrived so naturally that it took a moment to understand. The woman continued watching the rain. The lobby was beautiful. Her voice had become softer now, more distant. There was a coffee shop on the ground floor. The driver listened quietly. The owner knew everyone's order. A faint smile crossed her face. I used to stop there every Thursday. Outside, another traffic light change. Red became green. The taxi continued forward. The woman kept speaking, not to explain, not to convince, simply to remember. The coffee wasn't very good, she laughed softly. But everyone went there anyway. The driver found himself smiling. The memory felt real, comfortably real, the sort of detail people rarely invented. Not important enough to lie about. Exactly important enough to remember. The city slowly unfolded around them. Rainwater flowed along gutters. Apartment windows glowed softly behind curtains. The woman continued describing the building. The elevators. The lobby. The small bookstore nearby. The flower shop across the street. Each detail felt ordinary, yet each detail belonged to a place that no longer existed. A place swallowed by time. The driver suddenly realized something. The salaryman had not spent the journey talking about himself. The schoolgirl had not spent the journey talking about herself. And now this woman wasn't talking about herself either. All three passengers were talking about places, buildings, objects, moments, things they feared might disappear, things they wanted to see one more time. The thought lingered quietly, like a distant light peering through fog. Eventually the woman looked toward him. "Could you take me there anyway?" The driver blinked. "There?" She nodded. "Where it used to be." For a moment he considered refusing. The destination no longer existed. The request made little practical sense. Yet compared to everything else that night, it felt almost normal. The driver entered the approximate location. A route appeared. The taxi turned toward the city center, and together they drove through the rain. The journey took nearly 20 minutes. Neither spoke very much. The woman occasionally pointed toward familiar streets, or places she remembered. Most had changed. Some remained recognizable. Others had vanished completely, yet each discovery seemed to bring her a strange sense of peace, as though she had already accepted the outcome long ago. She merely wanted confirmation. One final look, one final visit. Eventually they arrived. The driver slowed the taxi, then stopped. The woman stared through the windshield. For several seconds she didn't move, didn't speak, didn't blink. Outside stood a modern office tower. Glass, steel, bright lobby lights. An entirely different building. An entirely different year. The old Takashima building was gone. Completely gone. The woman stared at it quietly. Rain rolled down the windows. The city remained silent around them. Then, unexpectedly, she laughed. Not bitterly, not sadly, genuinely. The sort of laugh people release after finally finding an answer. "So that's what happened." The driver looked toward the mirror. The woman smiled. And for the first time since entering a taxi, she appeared completely at peace, as though a question she had carried for many years had finally been answered. Outside, rain continued falling across Tokyo. Inside the taxi, neither noticed that the night was becoming stranger still, because somewhere beyond the sleeping city, another passenger was already waiting. And unlike the others, this passenger would not be looking for the past. They would be looking for someone. The woman remained seated for several moments after the taxi stopped. Outside, rain continued falling across the city. The new office tower stood where the old building had once existed. Glass walls reflected countless lights. Employees moved through the brightly lit lobby. A completely ordinary scene. A completely different world. Eventually the woman nodded softly to herself, then reached for the door. The driver expected the familiar problem. Old money, the same confusion, the same realization. Instead, the woman simply smiled. "I don't think I need to go inside." The driver nodded. Neither of them seemed surprised by that. The destination had never really been the building, only the answer, and now she had it. The woman bowed her head slightly, then stepped out into the rain. For a few moments, the driver watched her walk away, calm, unhurried, certain, as though she had finally reached the end of a very long journey. Then she disappeared into the city, and the taxi was empty once more. The driver sat quietly, listening to the rain. 3 passengers, 3 impossible stories, 3 people who seemed to belong somewhere else. The logical part of his mind continued searching for explanations. Coincidences, shared misunderstandings, unusual circumstances, anything. Yet each explanation seemed weaker than the last. The city outside remained perfectly normal, but the night itself no longer felt ordinary. The driver checked the time. 3:41 a.m., the deepest hours before dawn, the hours when even Tokyo seemed to dream. He drove without a destination for a while. The roads were nearly empty now. Only delivery trucks and occasional taxis moved through the rain. Traffic lights cycled endlessly for streets that contained almost nobody. Apartment towers stood silent. Convenience stores glowed brightly against the darkness. The city felt suspended, as though time itself had slowed. The driver lowered the radio volume slightly. Soft jazz continued drifting through the cabin. The familiar music helped. It grounded him, made everything feel normal again, at least for a little while. 20 minutes later, he found himself driving beside a river. Dark water flowed quietly below. Rows of apartment buildings stretched into the distance. Their reflections trembled across the surface. The driver watched the rain moving across the windshield, back and forth, the rhythm almost hypnotic. Then he noticed someone standing alone beneath a street lamp. A woman. No umbrella, no phone, no luggage, just standing there, waiting. The sight immediately felt different. Not frightening, not threatening, different. The previous passengers had been connected to places, buildings, years, memories. This woman seemed connected to something else entirely. The driver couldn't explain why. It was only a feeling, a quiet instinct, the sort that occasionally develops after years of observing strangers. The woman raised her hand. The taxi slowed, pulled toward the curb, and stopped. The rear door opened. She entered. For several moments neither spoke. Rain tapped softly against the roof. The city drifted by beyond the windows. The driver glanced toward the rearview mirror. The woman appeared young, perhaps late 20s. Dark coat, tired eyes, calm expression. Ordinary, yet unlike the previous passengers, she seemed immediately aware of her surroundings. Not confused, not curious, not searching, as though she already understood where she was, and perhaps why. The thought unsettled him slightly. "Where would you like to go?" he asked. The woman hesitated. For the first time, uncertainty crossed her face. Then she answered, "I'm not sure." The driver blinked. The response sounded sincere, not careless, not indecisive, simply honest. The woman looked toward the rain-covered glass, then quietly added, "I'm looking for someone." The driver nodded slowly, a simple answer. Yet somehow it felt heavier than anything he had heard all night. Because unlike the others, she wasn't searching for a place. She was searching for a person, and somehow that felt far more difficult. Outside, rain continued falling across Tokyo. Inside the taxi, the meter began counting once again, and the woman quietly watched the sleeping city, as though hoping to find a familiar face somewhere among the endless lights. For several minutes neither of them spoke. The taxi moved quietly through the sleeping city. Rain drifted across the windows. Streetlights reflected upon wet pavement. The river gradually disappeared behind rows of apartment buildings. The woman watched everything, not with curiosity, not with confusion, simply watching, as though every passing street might contain the answer she was looking for. The driver had carried many passengers searching for something. A restaurant, a hotel, a train station, a forgotten address. But searching for a person felt different, harder. The city contained millions of people. Finding one could take a lifetime. Eventually the driver asked, "Do you know where they are?" The woman smiled faintly. "No." The answer came without hesitation, as though she had already accepted that reality. The driver nodded, then asked, "Do you know their name?" For the first time, uncertainty crossed her expression. The woman looked toward the rain-covered window, then slowly shook her head. "No." The driver frowned slightly. She knew neither location nor name, only that she was searching. The situation should have seemed impossible, yet somehow it didn't. Not after everything else that night. The city continued passing by. A train crossed overhead. Its illuminated windows glowed briefly against the darkness, then disappeared. The woman followed it with her eyes, watching until the last carriage vanished. "I think I knew them once." Her voice was quiet, almost thoughtful. The driver waited. The woman continued, "I just can't remember." Outside, rain tapped softly against the roof. The words lingered, not because they were unusual, because they felt strangely sad. Most people forgot appointments, addresses, birthdays. Very few forgot people, and yet she seemed completely sincere. The driver found himself speaking more openly than usual, perhaps because of the hour, perhaps because of the rain, or perhaps because the entire night already felt impossible. "What do you remember?" The woman thought carefully, long enough that the driver wondered if she would answer at all. Finally she spoke. "A train station." The driver nodded. "A station?" She nodded. "There was rain." The driver smiled faintly. That narrowed things down very little. Tokyo contained hundreds of stations, and tonight seemed to contain endless rain. Yet the woman continued, "I remember waiting." The driver listened, and someone was supposed to arrive. Her eyes remained fixed on the city outside, but they never did. Silence followed. The taxi moved steadily through empty streets. The driver felt an unexpected heaviness settle over the conversation. Not grief, not regret, something quieter. The feeling of standing beside an unfinished story. The woman continued watching the rain, then suddenly laughed. A small laugh. Embarrassed. "I know how strange this sounds." The driver shook his head. After tonight, very little sounded strange anymore. The woman smiled. "I'm not even sure if I'm looking for them." The driver glanced toward the mirror. "Then my search." The answer arrived almost immediately. "Because I think they're searching for me too." Neither spoke after that. The rain seemed louder somehow. The city seemed further away. The driver found himself unable to think of a response, because for reasons he couldn't explain, the statement felt true, perfectly true, even if it made no sense. Several minutes later, the woman suddenly leaned forward. "Stop here." The driver blinked. Outside stood an ordinary pedestrian bridge crossing a narrow canal. Nothing remarkable. No station. No apartment building. No destination. Only rain. The driver pulled toward the curb and stopped. The woman stared through the window. For a long time she didn't move. Then she smiled. A genuine smile. The warmest smile the driver had seen all night. There. The driver followed her gaze. The bridge remained empty. No pedestrians. No waiting figure. Nothing. Yet the woman's expression never changed. She continued smiling, as though she had finally found what she came for, or perhaps remembered it. The woman reached into her coat pocket. The driver already knew what he expected to see. Old currency. Another impossible detail. Instead, she removed something else. A small photograph. The edges were worn. The image faded by time. The woman studied it quietly. then looked toward the bridge again. For a brief moment, her eyes became distant, not sad, not happy, simply peaceful, like someone remembering a dream just before waking. Then she carefully returned the photograph to her pocket and opened the door. Cool air drifted into the taxi. Rain whispered beyond the streetlights. Before stepping out, the woman turned back toward the driver. For the first time since entering the taxi, she asked him a question, a simple question, one that made his heart skip slightly. "Has it really been that long?" The driver didn't know how to answer, because for the first time that night, he wasn't sure which year she believed she belonged to, and before he could respond, the woman smiled once more, then stepped into the rain. The door closed softly behind her. The driver watched as she crossed the bridge. Halfway across, she stopped, looked toward the water below, and stood there quietly, as though waiting for someone, or perhaps finally meeting them. The driver never found out, because moments later, fog drifting from the river briefly obscured the bridge, and when it cleared again, the woman was gone. Not running, not hiding, simply gone. The bridge stood empty beneath the rain, and for the first time that night, the driver stopped trying to explain what was happening, because dawn was approaching, and somewhere in the sleeping city, one final passenger was waiting. For several minutes, the driver remained parked beside the canal. The bridge stood empty. Rain continued falling. Water moved quietly beneath the darkness. The city remained silent. Or perhaps it only felt silent now. After everything that had happened, ordinary sounds seemed distant, muted, like noises heard through a dream. The driver stood at the bridge, waiting, not because he expected the woman to return, because some part of him still wanted an explanation, a final glimpse, a simple answer, something. Yet nothing happened. The bridge remained empty. Eventually, he started the engine again. The heater hummed softly. The windshield wipers resumed their patient rhythm, and the taxi slowly pulled away. The clock on the dashboard read 4:26 a.m. Dawn was still hidden beyond the horizon. Yet the night was beginning to loosen its grip. The city felt different now. Not awake. Not yet. But changing. Some apartment lights had begun appearing. A few early trains moved through distant stations. Delivery trucks became slightly more common. Morning was approaching. Slowly. Inevitably, the driver suddenly found himself wondering if the strange encounters would end with the night. Perhaps that was all this had been. A collection of impossible passengers passing through the city before dawn. A brief disturbance. A passing storm. Soon the sky would brighten. People would wake. The city would return to normal. And perhaps these passengers belonged to the darkness itself. The thought felt strangely comforting. The taxi crossed a quiet intersection. Rain reflected pale orange traffic lights across the road. The driver glanced toward the clock again. 4:31 a.m. Only a little longer. Then the shift would end. He had almost decided to return toward the garage when he noticed someone standing outside a small train station. A man, alone, no umbrella, no luggage, no destination visible, simply standing beneath the station clock, waiting. The driver felt something tighten inside his chest. Not fear, recognition, because unlike the previous passengers, this man seemed familiar, very familiar, and the driver couldn't explain why. The station itself looked ordinary, small, quiet, almost empty. Only a few lights remained illuminated. Rain drifted through the station entrance. The man stood motionless beneath the clock, watching the street, watching the rain, watching nothing. Then slowly, he raised his hand, requesting a ride. The taxi approached and stopped. The rear door opened automatically. The man entered. For several seconds, neither spoke. The driver glanced toward the rearview mirror. Immediately, that strange feeling returned. Familiarity. Not because he recognized the passenger. He was certain they had never met. and yet something about him seemed known, like a face remembered from a dream, or someone glimpsed years ago and forgotten. The sensation refused to disappear. The passenger settled quietly into the seat, then looked toward the driver, not through the mirror, directly toward him, and smiled. A calm smile, the sort shared between old acquaintances. The driver's stomach tightened slightly, because none of the previous passengers had done that. They had looked at the city, the rain, the future. This passenger looked at him. "Where would you like to go?" the driver asked. The man considered the question, then softly replied, "That depends." The driver frowned. The answer sounded oddly familiar, as though the passenger had already expected the question. "Depends on what?" The man looked toward the rain-covered window, then back toward the driver, and quietly asked, "Do you know what year it is?" The driver's hands froze upon the steering wheel. Outside, rain continued falling across Tokyo. Inside the taxi, neither moved, neither spoke. The question hung between them. The same question, the exact same question, the one that had begun everything. The driver stared toward the mirror. The passenger continued smiling, patiently, as though waiting for confirmation, as though waiting to hear an answer he already knew. And for the first time that night, the driver no longer felt surprised, only certain that this passenger was connected to all the others, certain that he had been waiting for him, certain that the night had been leading here from the very beginning. Outside, the city drifted quietly toward dawn. Inside the taxi, the final journey was about to begin. For several moments, neither man spoke. Rain drifted softly across the windows. The windshield wipers moved back and forth. The city continued its slow approach toward morning. Yet inside the taxi, time seemed strangely still. The driver stared toward the rearview mirror. The passenger remained calm, patient, as though he had all the time in the world. Finally, the driver answered, "It's 2025. The passenger nodded, not surprised, not relieved, simply acknowledging something he already knew. The reaction unsettled the driver more than any answer could have. The salaryman had been relieved. The schoolgirl had been curious. The woman had been searching. This passenger seemed to have expected everything. Outside, the station slowly disappeared behind them. The taxi moved through nearly empty streets. The passenger watched the rain for a while, then quietly spoke. "You've had an unusual night." The driver tightened his grip on the steering wheel. It wasn't a question. The passenger spoke as though describing the weather. A simple fact. The driver hesitated, then nodded. "I suppose I have." The man smiled faintly. "They found you." The driver glanced toward the mirror. The passenger continued looking out the window, as though discussing something perfectly ordinary. "They found me." The man nodded. People rarely realize how many questions they carry. Rain tapped softly against the roof. The city glowed faintly beyond the glass. The passenger's reflection drifted across the window. Calm, steady, certain. For a while, neither spoke. The driver found himself thinking about the others. The salaryman from 1987. The schoolgirl carrying her cassette tape. The woman searching for a building that no longer existed. Each of them had arrived carrying something unfinished. A question. A memory. A destination. Something left unresolved. The passenger seemed to understand his thoughts. "You noticed it?" The driver nodded slowly. They were all looking for something. The man smiled. "Most people are." The answer felt strangely simple, yet somehow complete. The taxi crossed another bridge. Below, dark water reflected the first hints of approaching dawn. The blackness of the night was beginning to soften, not disappear, only soften. The passenger watched the river, then quietly said to people imagine time as a straight line. The driver listened. They imagined the past behind them, the future ahead, the present somewhere in between. Outside, rain continued falling. The passenger's voice remained calm, but memory doesn't work that way. The driver remained silent. The man continued, Neither does longing. The city passed around them. Apartment buildings, traffic lights, empty sidewalks, all drifting quietly through the darkness. Sometimes people hold on to a place, a person, a moment, so strongly that part of them never leaves. The driver found himself remembering the woman, the bridge, the photograph, the peaceful smile. For several minutes, neither spoke. The driver wasn't sure whether he understood, yet somehow the words felt familiar, like something he had always known but never put into language. The passenger finally looked toward him again. "Have you ever missed someone?" The question arrived gently, without judgment, without expectation. The driver thought for a long time, then nodded. "Yes." The passenger smiled. "So have they?" The answer carried no mystery, no supernatural weight, only quiet understanding, and somehow that made it more powerful. Outside, the rain gradually began to weaken. The first traces of dawn appeared beyond distant buildings. The city was waking, slowly, patiently. The passenger noticed it too. His expression softened. Morning already. The driver glanced toward the horizon. The sky had begun turning pale gray. For the first time all night, the darkness was retreating. The passenger seemed pleased by this, almost grateful. Then he looked toward the driver one final time. "Thank you." The driver blinked. "For what?" The man smiled. "For stopping." The answer felt oddly emotional, though the driver couldn't fully explain why. The passenger continued. "Most people hurry through life. They don't stop long enough to listen." Rain whispered against the windows. The city brightened slightly, and for a brief moment, the taxi felt impossibly quiet. Eventually, the passenger leaned back into his seat. The calm smile remained, the same smile he had won from the beginning. Then he spoke once more. A final sentence, a simple sentence, one that would remain with the driver for years afterward. "You'll forget most of our faces." The driver listened. "But you'll remember the feeling." Outside, dawn spread slowly across Tokyo. Inside the taxi, neither man spoke again, and for reasons the driver could never fully explain, he knew the passenger was right. The taxi continued moving through the city. Rain drifted gently across the windshield. The sky beyond the buildings had begun turning pale. Not bright, not yet, only lighter than before. The passenger sat quietly in the back seat. The driver remained focused on the road ahead. Neither felt any need to speak. Some conversations reached a natural ending. This was one of them. Tokyo was waking. Apartment windows brightened one by one. Convenience stores welcomed early customers. Delivery trucks appeared more frequently. The first commuters began moving toward stations. The city was slowly returning to itself. The familiar city, the ordinary city, the city that belonged to daylight. The driver suddenly realized he could no longer remember the exact faces of the earlier passengers. Not clearly. The details had already begun fading. The salaryman, the schoolgirl, the woman searching for the vanished building. He remembered them, yet their faces felt strangely distant now, like people from old photographs, or figures from dreams remembered only moments after waking. The realization should have troubled him. Instead, it felt natural. The final passenger had been right. The faces were fading. The feeling remained. The taxi approached a quiet intersection. The light changed. Red, green. The city continued moving. For several moments, the driver found himself thinking about unfinished things. Not the passengers, his own. Small things, forgotten things, people he had not called, places he had not visited in years, memories tucked away somewhere beyond daily routines. Perhaps everyone carried them. Questions, regrets, longings, moments that never fully disappeared. Perhaps that was simply part of being human. The rain weakened further. A faint golden glow appeared behind distant clouds. Morning was arriving. The passenger looked toward the brightening sky, then smiled, not with relief, not with sadness, simply appreciation, as though he had been hoping to see dawn one more time. The driver glanced toward the rearview mirror. For a brief moment, he considered asking a question, just one. Who are you? What happened tonight? Why did all of this happen? But the questions never left his lips. Some mysteries felt complete without answers. Some stories reached their destination without explanation, and somehow this felt like one of them. Several minutes later, the passenger leaned slightly forward. You can stop here. The driver looked ahead. The location seemed unremarkable. A quiet street, rows of trees, a narrow sidewalk, nothing more. No station, no office building, no obvious destination. Yet the passenger appeared completely certain. The taxi slowed, then stopped. The meter ended. The rain had almost disappeared now. Only a few droplets remained. The city felt fresh, renewed. The passenger opened the door. Cool morning air drifted into the vehicle. For a moment, neither moved. Then the passenger turned back toward the driver. The same calm expression, the same quiet smile, and with a small nod, he stepped out. The door closed softly behind him. The driver watched through the mirror. The passenger walked away beneath the pale morning sky, unhurried, peaceful, as though he had nowhere left to rush toward. The driver looked down briefly, adjusted the meter, turned off the gestation. Only a second passed, perhaps two. Then he glanced toward the mirror again. The street was empty. No footsteps, no retreating figure, nothing. Only the quiet city preparing for morning. The driver stared for several moments, then slowly smiled. Not because he understood, because he didn't. And somehow that was all right. The shift ended shortly afterward. The rain finally stopped. Clouds began separating above the city. Morning sunlight touched the tops of distant buildings. Tokyo awakened completely. Trains filled. Coffee shops opened. Ordinary life resumed. The driver returned the taxi, finished paperwork, collected his belongings, and headed home. Years would pass. Many years. Thousands of passengers would enter and leave his vehicle. Most would be forgotten. A few would remain. And every rainy season, when water traced familiar paths across the city windows, he would occasionally remember that night, the salaryman from another year, the schoolgirl protecting a cassette tape, the woman searching for a building long gone, and the final passenger who seemed to understand them all. He never learned exactly who they were. He never found an explanation. But perhaps explanations were never the point. Perhaps some people simply arrive carrying questions and leave carrying peace. Outside, another rainy night would eventually come. Another station. Another waiting passenger. Another taxi drifting through the city after midnight. And somewhere within the endless movement of Tokyo, stories would continue crossing paths for a few brief moments before disappearing once again. The city remembered. The rain remembered. And somewhere beyond memory and time, the journey quietly continued. *** and ...